Hello and welcome to Varnvlog. And today we're doing one of my forays down into politics in Oceania, particularly, I think, Australia today. We've had Australian comrades and Newfie comrades on Newfie, excuse me, Kiwi. Newfie's fucking Newfoundland. What the hell's happened? I'm getting my Commonwealth completely confused. What happens when you're an American? You don't care about geography at all. Anyway, that's completely irrelevant to anything we're about to talk about. I am talking to Communist Unity, three representatives of Communist Unity. I'm not talking to the whole thing, obviously. That would be weird. Today about their recent conference, what socialism looks like down in Australia, and we will talk about your merger with my favorite group of like the ultra sect, the Spartacist League, which is not an ultra sect in Australia, apparently, at least not anymore. So wanted to talk about that. I am looking through your general conference document for 2026. I have skimmed it. It is 104 pages. So, what it just for our mostly North American and European listeners, what is Communist Unity and where do you guys come from as far as your strategic and ideological bent? Broad question. Go.
Just real quick before we do that, I'll just do a really quick acknowledgement of country. I know that's maybe not as big of a thing in the States, but over here it still is. I'd like to say that Comrade Miller and I are speaking from Canberra, which is the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Comrade David here is speaking from Melbourne, also known as Nam, which is on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Beyond that, I think the best thing to do would be to turn this over to my two comrades on this panel who are members of the Central Committee and definitely have a lot more organizational experience.
Yeah, so I can talk on the history before the sort of orientation. So Communist Unity, I mean, to me personally, I joined in 2023. This is sort of even to that so small organization feels like sort of the dark, the mysterious, misted past. So there was a group in Australia, called Socialist Alliance. Which is a previous attempt at kind of left regroupment, quote unquote. It involved, at the time, the Democratic Socialist Party, which, tell me if I'm wrong, comrades, was like a Trot group. Not really sure what their vibe was.
It was It was essentially like it was sort of the official Canaanite group in Australia for a while. In fact, it was originally called the SWP, but over time it became a little bit strange in that by the end there were some factions of it that were vaguely approaching like a Marxiite position. So it was sort of muddled in the era of alliance between sort of those positions.
Yeah, and then
classic Trot and Marxiite defenses Trot, for those of
you pretty much. Well, Canaanite specifically because these guys were and are very enthusiastic about Cuba and sort of have some of the other quirks of sort of Canaanite Trotskyism.
So there was a Canaanite group in Australia when the Canaanite group in America, I guess, technically still exists, but it's like 4 90-year-olds.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so they did a electoral sort of pact project with, I think, only Socialist Alternative at that point, which is our Cliffite sect, who are the largest group in Australia.
So fun.
They have some 700 members now.
That's...
Salt, I believe, was involved in Alliance. I believe the other main partner in Alliance that sort of remained in Alliance for a little bit was the ISO, which I believe was the official Cliffite organization at the time. that's a little bit novel for me as well.
Okay, so just my audience knows, because the finer points of Trotskyism has been lost here. Trotskyism has, with the exception of the Grantites, aka the RCI/RCP, asterisk. How many damn RCPs does there need to be on asterisk? There's 3 in America. Or should I say the states? I don't want to claim the whole continent. So we have the SWP assault, which is different from our assault, which has a completely different origins, which has also totally confused me. Weirdly, my primary experience with Australian communists comes through high-profile former assault members like Ted Taza and Elizabeth Humphreys and people like that. And I'm surprised it's only 700 people, but I don't think I'm thinking about the scale difference in our population, because we're 320 million. So
and we're roughly about 27 million.
Yeah, I think historically the Communist Party of Australia was per capita the largest communist party in the West or something.
In the Anglosphere.
In the Anglosphere. Okay, not the West.
Yeah. the accursed Anglosphere. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And I believe that was the sort of and the heyday of that was obviously in the 40s.
But yeah, so they had this electoral pact that sort of fell apart after Socialist Alternative withdrew because actually, we hear all kinds of different conflicting versions of that story. But anyway, in classic fashion, a Trot group set up an electoral front and then liquidated themselves into it. And thus we have Socialist Alliance, and the DSP, Democratic Socialist Party, doesn't exist anymore. Socialist Alliance had a youth group, a youth reading group in Brisbane, which is the sort of capital city of the state of Queensland. And this youth group started heading in a slightly different direction politically than the rest of the organization, apparently. This is something Comrade Edith was there for all this. But this is just what I remember. And that group was called... They were heading a different direction. A Socialist Alliance head kicker came down from Sydney or something and berated them all furiously in a meeting. And all the, I think early 20-year-olds or whoever it was at the time said, screw this, we're leaving, and formed Unite. Unite then sort of split/died and became, and went in 2 directions. One of those directions are the group that would become Anarchist Communist Mianjin, which is the indigenous word for Brisbane, and are now part of the Anarchist Communist Federation of Australia. And the other half would unite with a high school reading group in Melbourne called the Collective of Leninist Youth, and thus you had the Revolutionary Communist Organization. We've now renamed ourselves Communist Unity.
And why did you rename yourself Communist Unity?
Mainly because I think the old name was not really adequately representative of our politics, in that initially the group that sort of split off from Unite was a group that was not initially sort of a clearly McNairite or partyist group. It was originally sort of much more vague in terms of its politics, and a fair bit more inclined towards like sort of direct action, sort of ultra leftist positions. So, for instance, the first publication of that organization was called Direct Action, and so ultimately the old name ended up being a bit of a relic of that period, one which sort of didn't really tell you about what our organization actually wants to do or what its actual orientation is. So eventually, fairly narrowly actually, we voted to change it in January.
But yeah, to speak a little bit more about that orientation, now we've given the history lesson. So the point of communist unity is to essentially or not reunite rather, but to unite the kind of socialist movement into a single mass communist party that's democratic and multi-tendency and united under a programmatic unity. And as part of that, I guess there's lots of little sub goals or sort of goals that are inherently included in that. We aim to kind of get rid of the culture of sectarianism, which extends beyond just the fact that there are lots of different separate organizations. We also, at last conference, we really had an orientation, or some of us did, and this is sort of, I think, what was addressed somewhat in Christina and Anthony's article on the conference that was published in Partisan, against activism, what we call activism, which is sort of a pejorative that's launched in many different ways. We kind of meant it both in the way that like Paulo Freire and the way that Bordiga mean it. So just unthinking, stupid, constant activity, which we see as part of sectarianism. So that's our goal.
Unthinking, stupid, constant activity seems to be a perpetual problem. And I think it's hard. I mean, in the United States, it feels hard because we're having one crisis after another. It seems like it might be slightly calmer down there in Australia these days anyway. How did you derive your program? I mean, do you have a program yet? And if you do, how did you derive it?
We do have a program. It used to be much longer. We shortened it dramatically at conference without losing really any of the political content. We shortened it from 64 to 17 A4 pages. I actually have a physical copy here somewhere, a little mock-up. So it's actually hypothetically hand-outable. In terms of how it's derived, it's kind of a creature of the founders of the organization who drafted it up basically just based on discussion, inspired by, I believe it was inspired quite heavily by the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain - Provisional Central Committee, McNair and
Jack.
Jack Conrad's organization.
Conrad,
But then kind of adapted to fit the Australian context a little bit more, and also obviously in relation to that organization's program being a little bit more solid on women's liberation and trans liberation. But yeah, and then I think since we've gone through, I would say like two sort of serious conferences, which was the 2024 one and the one we just had, it's now been subject to kind of more democratic contestation. That I think you could say the program has more like legitimacy, quote unquote. But yeah.
How influential is the Weekly Worker / the work of the Communist Party Provisional Committee of Great Britain? I ask that because I've always find it interesting that a group of about 40 people, has inspired movements way larger in the other parts of the Anglosphere. So how did you guys get interested in that? What prompted an interest in that from other forms of communist organization? I asked that because one of the interesting things about the CPGB, and I did a study on all their founding documents way back, is they didn't change their constitution at all. So they're still actually kind of working under the same constitution as most of the formerly Comintern-aligned communist parties in Great Britain. But their program's very different. And I was going to ask you, why did that become relevant to you in Australia? Anyone can answer.
Well, this seems to me to be much more of an in-depth question, but I suppose we'll have to answer as best as we can without her.
Well, I can answer the historical element. The Weekly Worker itself doesn't actually have much influence in the founding of the group, except indirectly, because it was really founded when that reading group that would split off to become the RCO read Cosmonaut.
Oh, okay.
It was actually, apparently they got to McNair very late. But in terms of Weekly Worker article influence these days, it's hard to say. I mean, personally, I don't really look to the Weekly Worker for kind of, what I think on a given topic necessarily. I'm not against it. I don't think it particularly guides the way our publication is structured either, except in that the Weekly Worker, delights in commenting on the rest of the left, and I agree that that's important.
Well, that makes sense. Actually, it does make sense. Cosmonaut has a broader purview. I read the Weekly Worker partly as a gossip mag for how the UK left is disintegrating at any given time, and also for I do find McNair's historical articles and Conrad's historical articles to be quite useful.
RevStrat is a revolutionary strategy is a major reading for us.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you found Cosmonaut first, as a person who, while not a part of Cosmonaut, has been around that orbit since before it was founded. Cosmonaut's interesting because it seems to pick up on the social republicanism part of McNair and the willingness to look at the entire purview of communist history and just say, we're not kicking any of this out. Even we're gonna everything from ultras to namby-pamby, almost liberal shit. We're going to be willing to engage with it in some kind of array. Now there's kind of multiple publications around. Cosmonaut, there's also Marxist Unity Group's Light and Air, which is much more specific, but also does the historical work. So it's interesting that got to you first. Okay. How has it been wrangling former Trot groups into these alliances, since most of them have the same post-1921 faction ban that almost all successor groups to the Bolsheviks do?
Well, I think sort of the interesting thing about the Spartacist measure is that we were not the ones who reached out to them. They were the ones who reached out to us.
Holy shit. All right.
Yeah. So that's sort of the surprising thing. And the sort of conditions by which measure was achieved were also quite incredible, in that it sort of what were put forward by the Spartacists in sort of the negotiations surrounding that were not really you need to change your program in order to sort of compromise with us in this respect. It was much more the case of them entering us, knowing that they would be a minority, and sort of accepting accepting unity on the basis of the current program, and on the basis of their right to agitate to change the program. And so in that respect, I think it was sort of almost a sort of unmitigated, or I'm not quite sure what the right word would be there, but a no frills sort of unity. It wasn't sort of it was, other than sort of logistically speaking, which is a bit of a different matter. It was not a sort of politically complicated merger in terms of the demands put forward.
Yeah, it was practically the furthest thing from what you would usually see in larger groups, which is just effectively a smash and grab, right? But when it comes to broader groups more generally, I think we do have to temper a bit of caution in thinking that this is easily replicable to other sects, especially larger sects. And that gets us to the broader political landscape of what effectively Cliffist groups there are within the country. I think when it comes to other Trotskyist groups, I mean, the RCI has cynically set up a small, tiny group in Australia now in the past couple of months, but they don't seem to really have any traction starting right now. But you will see the proliferation of cliffist and what people in lots of Cosmin or weekly work groups would say post-cliffists, because they just essentially adapt anything that was taken oppositionally to the USSR to the present day, which I still don't know how you can call yourself a Trotskyist after 1991, but here we are.
Same. That's what got me to read
socialist-
McNair way back in the day, was why do we still have Trotskyists after 1992? But go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So with Socialist Alternative, it's about 700 members to roughly between 90 to 100 so far, full cadre members, etc. Their main opposition is not, in fact, alliance. It would be a group known as Solidarity. And to explain the distinction between two, theoretically, it's almost there's almost nothing to tell between the two of them. They're virtually the same. It's that these emerged out of a split within the Australian sections of the British SWP. So the original British Cliffist SWP had it expelled 2 senior members of its Australian sections, and I believe a couple of others, but the main 2 were 2 guys called Mick Armstrong and Sandra Bloodworth. And these, we don't know all the details about what happened, but you can essentially imagine that most of it was personal related, in the same way that most of these.
There was a political element, which was that the ISO, which is now Solidarity, funnily enough, much smaller than Socialist Alternative. They're actually about the same size as us, 80 people-ish. They had this thesis, I think the line was like the 90s is the 30s in reverse, with the logic of the 1990s was this period of revolutionary buildup, now that the Soviet Union had gone and there was more social contestation. And the people that were expelled, Mick Armstrong and Sandra Bloodworth, I think probably had the correct line of, well, no, that's stupid. We're actually very much in for the opposite. But yeah, sorry, go on, Christina.
Yeah. So as a result, we have 2 groups. One is much smaller than the other, whose politics nowadays, as compared to the 90s, don't actually map on to be quite antagonistic, but they are the most oppositional in terms of any sectarian gripes you could have between 2 groups. Like, they will refuse to attend each other's events. You know, they will always be, if they're in some kind of event, which they do have some measure of voting, they will always be the ones to point out and argue and vote against whatever the motions there would be. Where the events, if they're doing like joint tabling or whatever, will turn quite hostile. But that is effectively the pond we swim in. And I would be really over-optimistic to say that there's something akin to what happened with the Spartacist League that will happen anytime soon with those 2 organizations. So really, what we see as the areas with sort of greatest movement have either, they operate around ML or ML adjacent circles, or they have a much more open and multi-tendency socialist sort of conception, even if they might not have open factionalism with other organizations. There's a lot of internal diversity, despite the fact that they have a single line that you can't contest.
And on the sort of way that unity with the Spartacists went, yeah, I mean, they really did come to us. I mean, we had done a brief period of joint work in sort of a faction we've set up in the Socialist Party, which is a kind of new electoral sort of front created by Socialist Alternative. It's now kind of veering off the tracks and becoming more than a sort of electoral front. It's kind of become a kind of party formation project in a bizarre way. I mean, what's funniest about this is you read some of Socialist Alternative's founding documents, and they're railing against kind of neither reform nor revolution broad left parties, and then have gone and created one. With the explicit logic when you ask their members about this is, yeah, but we're like a revolutionary faction in that party, even though we have a majority on everything. So we can have it both ways, is their logic. But really, this has come from the international leadership, the International Communist League, of the Spartacists. It's them who have kind of pushed this reorientation after their sort of guru, whose name I've forgotten, passed away.
James Robertson.
James Robertson, thank you.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, I mean, I think it was after that happened that they then joined the DSA, tell me if I'm wrong, and have gotten involved in your party in Britain. And we were, I mean, very surprised. I mean, we were expecting, you know, that there was political willingness, but there would be sort of roadblocks. And I mean, there was a point where the Spartacists kind of got a little bit cold during the Unity project and then immediately, you know, switched. But I mean, there's no way that this is a kind of smash and grab, as in history, as Christina referred to, because I mean, they've given the Communist Unity full control, basically, of all their Australian assets.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, if it was a smash and grab, it's not a very good one.
Yeah. Well, it's
It's when you had Sparts joining the DSA, I when I learned about that, I almost spit out my tea.
I think having read their sort of at least external facing documents about sort of their position in DSA, it seems to me that their position towards DSA is much closer to something like, say, the ALP down here, because they also relatively recently tried to do an intervention into the Australian Labor Party. So where I very much do not think that they have any sort of smash and grab orientation towards us in the RCO/Communist Unity. They're sort of the stuff that the documents relevant to the sort of the DSA intervention for them indicate to me that it is still sort of a more hostile entryist project where they aim to sort of split the left off from DSA. Or at least that's sort of the impression I got from reading the articles in like Workers' Hammer about it.
Whereas they view us as part of the revolutionary left,
Yes,
sort of
yes.
vacillating on certain topics that they think
Yes.
we're more reformist on or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
You stutter. I mean, yeah, it's very shocking.
I'm generally flustered because I've dealt with Sparts since I was a teenager. And
Well, you're not alone in being flustered like that. It certainly sparked some interest down here.
Yeah. I've even dealt with. I mean, I was associated with two different. I've never formally been a Trotskyist, but I was associated with two different Spartacist League splits: the International Bolshevik Tendency and Platypus Affiliated Society. And who hate me a lot. But I that for a while we used to say that who needs COINTELPRO when the Spartans exist. So like I've only seen them be reasonable for the last 2 years, and I am like a little bit shocked. But I guess this does tell you something about the nature of sex, because it does seem like this was largely driven by a few very old people who were in the center of leadership. Similarly with like the Canaanites. I mean, I think technically the US SWP may still exist. I know Pathfinder books still exist.
It does still exist. It is very bizarrely gone in the direction of being Zionism. It is bizarrely gone in the direction of Zionism. And
that's
it has
wild. Okay.
It has a couple of international affiliates, both called the Communist League in Britain and Australia, which have also gone in that direction, but neither of which I think are particularly substantial at all. I believe the Militant actually is still publishing in the US.
Yeah, I think it is. I just the last time my encounters with Canaanites is that they were ancient. Like, they would show up to your thing and you're like, wow, you're a generation and a half removed from me, and I'm, well in the middle age. But I suspect they're very tiny. I suppose this gets into, though, some of the things with Yeah, one of the implications of what I was talking about with neo-Trotskyism and McNair is McNair's group has actually always been quite small. The CPGB Provisional Committee hits way above its weight in members, just as the amount of effect it's had. And I think part of its effect here is a historical accident. And the reason why I say that is we were reading it to get the dirt on the British Trots, because most American Trotskyist organizations after the 1990s actually come from the British variants who came in during the alter-globalization movements. Our indigenous Trots, excuse me, I shouldn't use indigenous because that makes it sound like they're first peoples. Our national Trotskyist groups were mostly stagnant after the 1980s. They didn't really, they were mostly in 50 people, very stale central committees that hadn't changed in 30 years, that sort of thing.
Whereas it was like, well, Trotskyism in sort of like Commonwealth countries was effectively the same as, say, new communist or Maoist movements in the United States. Roughly sketch. Yeah, so it does make a lot of sense that this would be an alter-globalization 90s thing that especially comes from Britain as like an import. And that's also true to some cases here. There was never really a major Maoist movement here in Australia. You had the CPGB-ML, a split from that, but I mean, their numbers are almost nothing nowadays, and they are pretty much remembered with the legacy as being
the CPA-ML.
The CPA-ML, sorry.
Yeah.
They're effectively remembered about as much as, anti-CPA strikebreakers and scabs.
Yeah. So. It's interesting about the States because if you look at like the countries that have big Maoist influences and their youth communist movements, and you look at countries that have big Trotskyist influence and youth communist movements, we weirdly had both at different times. So the issue that you had is that the Shachtmanite and Draperite Trots all entered the Socialist Party, which self-dissolved in the middle of the 1960s. And then so some of the largest Trotskyist tendencies that weren't aligned to the SWPUS became either the Socialist Party of the United States, the SPUSA, or the forerunner to the DSA. And after the ISO self-exploded here over sexual harassment and sexual misconduct scandals, and also it being enforced because there was several $1 million publishing industry built on top of it. Every Trotskyist group seemed to enter into the DSA again. And also kind of with the exception of Reform and Revolution Caucus, and I guess Spectre Magazine, lose their identity. I mean, one of the things about the post-Cliffites here and the Cliffites here, and I think calling them post-Cliffites is actually probably accurate, is they gave up Trotskyism as soon as the organization was gone for the most part. Just like, mixed, wildly variant on where they went when the ISO collapsed here. And it's interesting to compare that to Australia because sometimes I do think, we have a similar weird relationship to Great Britain. But I have always wondered why Australia didn't have more of a Maoist movement, because you do have, strong Indigenous peoples movements in your country, you're a settler state too, and usually Maoist politics adjusts itself to that particularly well. So why this is wild speculation and kind of off topic, but why do you think there wasn't ever a large Maoist movement in Australia?
Well, I think just to go back to something you said earlier on the ICL's sort of international kind of leadership that are redirecting the change. I don't actually think it's quite as old as you would expect. I mean, we met a couple of them as they came down for our conference of observers. And there was something weird. I don't know the exact specifics. that happened in the ICL were a bunch of Quebec nationalists joined the ICL at some point, I think in the past 10, 20 years, and sort of got a lot of influence. And a lot of those guys, I mean, we met one of them, they seem like 40s, 50s, rather than, being, 60s, 70s, 80s communists. They seem a bit younger. But anyway, as to why Maoism didn't take root, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that it's possible that we had the classic thing of after the Sino-Soviet split, our kind of Ofcom party, split into kind of a Maoist-aligned wing and a sort of Stalinist, whatever you want to say, aligned wing. My understanding is that they were just so busy sectarianly bashing each other that they had no time to recruit, in I guess, indigenous youth or students or whatever. And also, I think even in the 60s, 70s, I don't think you could say that indigenous Australians were integrated into mainline capitalist life enough for that contact to really exist with sort of communists based around kind of industrial workers and students. I mean, we still had the stolen generation, which for your viewers who might not know is, a bunch of indigenous kids were, stolen from their families and, basically sold off to white families. I mean, the sectarianism got so intense that when, so we had a union in this country called the Builders Labourers Federation, the BLF, which was kind of its New South Wales branch. I don't know how well your viewers know Australian geography. It's one of the eastern states.
I'd encourage people
Sydney
to pull up a map while we're explaining it.
The New South Wales branch got taken over by a Communist Party militant and basically turned into kind of a cooking house for the Communist Party. I mean, it was still very there was very little explicit Marxist rhetoric. They were doing a lot of, sort of, Marxist humanism. They had this ideology they spread of the quote, moral responsibility of labor. But anyway, so the New South Wales branch gets taken over by the Communist Party, leads a bunch of really militant strikes, and these strikes are in solidarity, against apartheid in South Africa, against with the environment, against development in the coral reef, all that stuff. And a CPA-ML member, i.e. a Maoist, was a secretary in the leadership of the BLF and collaborated with the government in smashing the union, the New South Wales branch, because they were CPA. And smashing to such an extent that eventually the BLF had to run off with their union list and money because they got put into administration and banned, or I don't remember the specifics. So I just think they were too busy wrecking each other to, recruit for a big Maoist movement.
The thing I'll perhaps add on top of that, and sort of I'm a bit vaguer on this particular period of history as well, is that I think, at least to some extent, some of that sort of energy in opposition to sort of communist officialdom was more taken up by I think Trotskyism in Australia than it was Maoism, more so than it was in the US, where it was proportionally where proportionally both Maoism and Trotskyism sort of flourished a bit in that period. I think it was more sort of on the Trotskyist side here.
I will say, at least when it comes to nowadays, you may see a bit of a bridging beyond that gap between sectarian squabbles that, mean Maoism has no drag amongst communities that you would think would be most open to that kind of politics. You have a couple of groups, but they don't necessarily draw from the same reservoir as you would say, split from official communist parties or anything that you saw in the classic era of the Maoist groups of the 60s and 70s. It's more like you had, for example, another group that we frequently chat with is a group called Red Ant, the Red Anti-Imperialist Collective, which originally started as a Marxist Trotskyist group that effectively you could imagine as the PSL if it was 10 times smaller. And with all the same weird things of the PSL, in which you kind of have a tiered hierarchy of people's verbiage, honestly. Like, you go closer and closer towards leadership, and they go from sounding like Marxist Leninists to sounding like weird. There's all these weird little remnants of Trot speak within how they talk. That was the case, and what they found was that they were picking up so many young, either indigenous or migrant community peoples who were more attracted to just classic Marxist Leninism, and you would see the phenomena you have with Zuma Stalinism and whatnot. And they found that was an existential threat to their majority. So the Marxist leadership of the organization split to go and found a group called
They cooed their own organization, seized control of the finances, all that.
Yeah,
Lovely.
And so you have a very ecumenical Marxist-Leninist organization now running around, which has people that you can work with quite well, and also ones that you could describe as quite sectarian. But
sometimes people who and sometimes people who are one on one day and one the other.
I mean, that's fair. I feel like sometimes I am ecumenical one day, and the next day I'm a raging sectarian of one. So.
Yeah,
but
you do also. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So
Go ahead.
I mean, for a little bit more context, sort of the original Red Ant was very much in the sort of tradition of our DSP. It was sort of the DSP split over the issue of Socialist Alliance, over sort of liquidating into Socialist Alliance. One part of that split eventually merged with the Cliffites. One of those splits was the Revolutionary Socialist Party, which later merged with Socialist Alternative into Socialist Alternative, which is why Socialist Alternative will nominally allow you to believe in the degenerated worker state theory.
It's very interesting to have this claim that they support kind of unity that is, as long as you're not a Stalinist or a reformist. They have all these sort of members who are from the old DSP who are kind of allowed to say what they want, and they can't get rid of them. It's quite interesting.
They're allowed to like wear Che t-shirts and say that the USSR is a degenerated worker state. Literally, one of the main people mainly like does that in terms of sort of the DSPs in his politics. But anyway, a bunch of those people eventually left SALT because they didn't like being in that organization for a number of reasons, and they formed Red Ant. And then eventually they could their own organization to take the funds and form Red Spark, which is the Red Ant splinter.
There's a lot of trot-spotting you can do in Australia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which maybe brings us back to what was mentioned at the beginning, which was, you've said that your main interaction with a lot of people in the Australian left is people who are disgruntled, either former SALT or SALT adjacent kinds, where, I mean, what I'll say about that is we in RCO Communist Unity, whatever, there is a phenomenon we like to call SALT derangement syndrome. Because it's the biggest organization on the left, you see a lot of accusations drawn towards it that you would honestly find to be incredibly exaggerated. And it honestly comes, in most cases, from like a position of people who feel actually traumatized from being handed a pamphlet once and being said, "Would you like to join our organization?"
Yes.
So that brings us towards more sort of our position. It's that, there are genuine reasons to be against a group like this. It's like highly undemocratic in its internal organization. It has a tendency to tail whatever's the most popular, like demonstration action that day. Like one day it could be, go and assault a Tesla because Elon Musk and Donald Trump are evil. Or, the next it would be strike for climate or for Palestine, which is a recurring thing every few months. And what we've, not to be too speculative, but when it came to setting up first Victorian Socialists and now just the Socialist Party, because it's expanded to all of the states, Socialist Alternative may or may not have a sharper divide nowadays between those who feel quite invested in that project because it is actually quite successful for what it does, although it does sort of really only sell itself to about 5% of the electorate of young people who would vote for the Greens Party. But that still feels, you know, in your myopia of being on the left, that still feels like momentum. Versus the inner leadership who still like, if you could describe the strategy by extrapolating, you know, what they've said in the past and, you know, how they go about themselves now, it seems to be like the classic Cliffist thing of like, if, you know, you push for society-wide reforms within an electoral party, you watch and your members watch as they fail. And then, you know, once they're all angry enough because of that, you go and split off the ones who feel like they can commit to a real revolutionary stance now. Rinse and repeat effectively. And that also applies to the strategy of revolution they seem to have, which is push reforms and watch them fail. And then step 3 is like question mark, question mark, question mark. And then step 4, you know, the revolution has come.
I mean, I think these are really the political stakes in Australia, and I think it's why our organization sends kind of a lot of the sects sort of off the edge mentally, is because although, yeah, we present ourselves as a unity project, we're also the only group in Australia that's actually interested in saying, no, our strategy should involve being openly revolutionary from day one, but not in like this kind of way that people imagine after, you know, they take like Marxist values tests that, you know, it's either reform or revolution, you know, you can't do both. By which I mean in the sense that, like, if you're revolutionary, you don't do electoral politics or you don't do trade unions. You know,
an ultra-leftist.
Yeah. I mean, you know, this is what's weird about us, at least in Australia, is we're both the ones trying to say you have no right to exist as a separate organization, but also like we should do revolutionary rhetoric and strategy and tactics.
So the interpretation of revolutionary Marxism in Australia is similar to what it was in the United States before 2012, which is no electoral work whatsoever, not even like oppositional or abstentionist electoral work or anything like that. Is that like the common position, or
no? But what I mean is the other sects think that's what the position of being a revolution think that position is that
okay, got it.
You paint yourself as kind of the revolutionary in contrast to the rest of the existing left, you must be an abstentionist.
And this I think was demonstrated by sort of Socialist Alternative's previous position on elections, which was in fact that up until the formation of Victorian Socialists, Socialist Alternative believed, and they say this verbatim, that there was no point in running in elections in Australia, no point whatsoever.
And then in 2017, they completely flipped.
And yeah, in 2017 they completely flipped, and now elections is one of the main things that they do.
Not to make this a referendum on Trotskyism, but as far as like Cliffite and Cliffite related organizations, many such cases.
Well, yeah.
But like, I mean, the flipping back and forth between, I mean, in the United States, it was particular between tailing democratic movementism around the Democratic Party here, and then we don't work with anybody ever. So that made them very fun. However, in the United States, though, the ISO did control a whole lot of socialist publications. They had a large influence through their relations, through their strained relationship with the IST on the Historical Materialism Conference, Haymarket Books, the ISR, the International Socialist Review, et cetera, et cetera. And that gave them a kind of a large influence. And then we had our own version of SALT, which is confusing because they're not Cliffites, they're militant. And the militant there is not the same militant as the militant published by the SWP. We have a dearth of names. It's really kind of a
Can
problem.
I just say, Socialist Alternative members hate the SALT acronym.
Yeah.
And bizarrely, the one they prefer is SA, which is quite puzzling.
Not the best one you could have for a
Yeah,
socialist
like-
organization with ties to the British ones. But
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
that's-
well, yeah.
yeah. But
There's
I
a
think
bunch of
with-
reasons why SA doesn't have great associations, but
Yeah. But I think with the Socialist Party, that maybe steers us out of talking about the sects around here to more
Good.
like the broader political economy here, because it would be very alienating to just talk about that the entire time.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I was gonna. But how can you give me a general feel for where the left is in Australia? The last time I was talking to an Australian comrade, we were talking about the recognition of country, formal vote. I think how many years ago was that? Like 3?
Oh, the
2?
voice referendum. That
Oh,
was
the voice
about 2.5 years ago.
Okay, yeah, so
Yes.
right before that, and I got a lot of the trying to explain what was at stake there for in Australia to an American audience and to an Anglophone audience, mostly in the Northern Hemisphere. But what are the stakes right now, and how is the broader Australian left arrayed around those stakes? Because I suspect my audience knows next to nothing.
Well,
Yeah.
so to paint a map of the socialist part of that, we are irrelevant to wider society. I mean, it's not even like the DSA where, there's not much relevance, but like, in New York, there's like a lot of people, they hold these big social events, they get involved in like electoral projects, and they have, I think you could say, like a level of impact that maybe leads to success or failure of electoral projects, whether that's a good or bad thing, but they do that. Whereas in Australia, we don't really. The most that we are relevant is that we have blocks at rallies sometimes, by which I mean you can see which ones are the sort of reds. And obviously there's 12 different red groups and none of us are working together. In terms of wider society, I mean, the stakes that are happening right now are that after the voice referendum, which just to sort of, for those who don't know, there was a referendum put forward by the Labour government on having a body added to the constitution, which wouldn't have had any formal legislative power at all, but sort of had the power to advise on issues relevant to Indigenous people, and it would be stocked with kind of Indigenous elders. And the kind of left of the Indigenous liberation movement quite rightly pointed out that they all would have been kind of like the most bourgeois and kind of most conciliatory of the Indigenous leadership. But anyway, on that, the left was extremely confused. You basically had the kind of sort of liberal left that wanted, inclusion of some sort, whatever, and thus supported the voice. There was sort of aligned more with the Indigenous nationalist elements, what was called the progressive no, which was the idea of, we oppose the voice on the grounds that it's kind of assimilatory, which is certainly true. And, the argument was that the process that had been laid out decades ago was that it should be a treaty before a voice. And there is no treaty in Australia so far. I think Victoria has one in its state, but there is no federal treaty at all. And most states and territories don't have one. So after this, one of our comrades, Edith, who would have been on today, but unfortunately is not feeling well, I think pointed out and has been basically proven utterly correct, is that progressive no sounds great, but a no vote winning the referendum completely gives credence and justification to those in Australia who think that the process of kind of liberal multiculturalism has hit, its justifiable end. And I think that it is completely true that the recent kind of like strengthening of the right in Australia has been a sort of downstream of the no vote winning that referendum. And this kind of right wing has taken a couple of forms. First of all, it's meant the Liberal Party is gone. It is split into now a kind of mainstream bourgeois but vaguely socially progressive wing, which is also really climate conscious. That's something that's very strong in Australia. Climate politics are a really strong indicator. And these people have become what are called the teal independents, which are independents not formally in one party, but who are all funded by the same climate billionaire, one of Australia's handful of billionaires.
Teal being a mix of blue and green, obviously.
Yes. And the others who are just more traditional conservatives and have thus become increasingly reactionary because of sort of social polarization. And that's all led into the growth of One Nation around Pauline Hanson, who's been a kind of reactionary, sort of demagogic figure in Australia since the 90s. The stakes are then around that are that now there is this kind of increasing, and this is classic, and you will know all about this, is the right is rising, we kind of need to unite to fight the right, this kind of popular frontist crap. Then there's stakes there because in our organization we passed a motion basically thinking that actually Pauline Hanson would not win. We don't think that unless something major changes that the alt-right will really succeed in Australia for various reasons. Whereas, a lot on the left are panicking and are just totally selling out as a result. Anyway, I've talked for a while, but that's to me, I think, the current stakes.
Maybe to sketch just what we mean by the battle lines here. It's Australian politics for the longest time was dominated by the Liberal National Coalition, which is the coalition of Liberal Party, the National Party. This has been de facto with a couple of exceptions.
Urban bourgeois and rural bourgeois. Combined,
with some exceptions, such as in the 80s and around the early 2010s, they have been the hegemonic party of order ever since the end of World War II. They were the ones that essentially set the political weather for the majority of time, and they reached their sort of apotheosis under John Howard during the 2000s. But over the course of the 2010s, you saw what effectively started first as personal spats between different successors to Howard that wanted to control the party, say a guy named Tony Abbott and also someone named Malcolm Turnbull. That degenerated to such a point where no real significant force could lead the party, which was then taken over by a guy called Scott Morrison, who was mercurial enough to win in 2019 off of climate-based reaction to a lot of major demonstrations causing stuff like coal blockades, which actually caused quite significant flack against a lot of the environmental movement. Now, after he won, his momentum disappeared almost instantly because of the 2019 bushfires, which I'm sure made world news around that time. And was essentially a lame duck. And was essentially a lame duck for the next 3 years, essentially, until in 2022, Anthony Albanese, who had not so much blared the party because the Labour Party had already gone through that process, but even stuff like we're no longer going to tell people that we're taxing your investment homes or whatever. That's the scale of defanging anything that stank of radicalism within the Labour electoral pitch. They won a one-seat majority, although no other party could come close to one seat of an absolute majority in the chamber. And that persisted despite the fact that the voice referendum was defeated quite handedly a year later. I believe it was like a 2-to-1 no to yes. And so everyone going into 2025 had this view that, especially with just the reaction to Trump's victory, that there was going to be a washing out of Labour from power, which for a majority of reasons, but you could say the mainstream one would just be to say that people were very shocked by Trump in general and did not want any of that, either direct coercion from the US or any kind of replication of that politics here. Clung for dear life to what seemed the most stable thing, which was to re-elect the Labour government.
They got the biggest
And so
majority
the
I think they've ever had in history.
Yes.
the biggest majority for Labour, the second biggest majority for a party in post-war history. So it's about 94-ish seats. So what actually happened was the Liberal Nationals, in spite of the press stories that they were, gunning for the leadership, they could take back Parliament. They lost a good 15 or so seats to either independents, outright flips to Labour, or just vote splittings that made it so that really the party is now on its last legs, effectively. They break up into the Nationals and Liberals are splitting and getting back together because they realize that would be an even worse idea every other week. And what you've seen is, although this isn't reflected in the composition of Parliament, the rise of what's known as Pauline Hanson's One Nation, which is the classic petty bourgeois reaction party, which also draws a lot of strength from either small business owners or blue-collar districts and you go out and interview these sorts of people who are like Labour to One Nation, or you will ask them, what are their beliefs? And they have de facto not very changed that much. They still believe in many, of the progressive social or economic beliefs that they once had when they were still diehard red. But it's just that they think that either Anthony Albanese personally is dislikable, whereas Pauline Hanson is a political fighter and whatnot, and that's respectable. Or it's just that the state of housing or cost of living in general is downstream of multiculturalism as a policy, and that when you have an addressing of that question, you can apparently solve all these problems. So right now, One Nation polls at between, I want to say 25 to 30%. David would be best with the numbers.
I'd say 20 to 25%.
20 to 25%, which looks like almost European in how you could narrativize it. But it's our view within the organization, based on what was passed, that this is not a pathway to a majority, because there is just the electoral math you would have to bend reality to have that kind of a thing occur. The only way there would be a conservative reaction winning outright would be the Liberal Party somehow gets its shit together and can unite around an anti-immigration populist alliance. But for a number of reasons, especially because the people that still vote for him would say on polls consistently that they would never support even entering an electoral pact with One Nation. So that for more or less, it's our view within the organization that there will be a consistent period of Labour's dominance or political hegemony over society, but that doesn't necessarily mean a stable one. There will be lots of outrage, and especially even if just by entropy itself, the Labour government will be unpopular enough to have some kind of electoral contest at some point in the future. But for the time being, that doesn't seem too salient. So in spite of the fact that the polling looks especially bad for centre-left progressivism within the country, it doesn't necessarily map onto what political outcomes there might be. The most you will see either is, instead of a rise of the right or a fascism, you will see like the entrenching of very authoritarian measures by liberal incumbents. Maybe not as bad as in, say, the UK, but already with things like you saw with the response to the Bondi terrorist attack, you see a general toughening of state response to what looks like threats to national cohesion, and that's emerging as a term more and more now, especially this year, that this is damaging to our national fabric. Therefore, we have to some state governments outlawing even the most tame of pro-Palestinian slogans to be thrown at rallies.
I think also one thing I just want to add, just really quickly. Sorry, I know we've gone on for a while here. Compared to America, I mean, I think in Australia, I think this is something that people internationally don't really catch. We basically have the kind of union, legal, and institutional framework of Mussolini's Social Republic. In that we have a court system that is basically arbitrarily able to decide when a strike is legitimate or not, and therefore on that basis just seize union funds. I mean, the parts that's similar to everywhere is union density is decreasing. It's primarily in public servants, etc. But I mean, I think, the left here isn't even doing the kind of base building tenant organizing stuff that you get in America, which of course has a bunch of problems and is in many ways very rightist in the way it's done. But we don't even have that.
Yeah, especially because unlike in America, landlordism isn't really a big corporate thing. It's actually, the bulk of it is made up by individual entrepreneurs or people that view that having an investment home is the best way to leverage whatever meager income that they do have. So tenant organizing is a bit different and also a bit more difficult in those cases. But as was said, there is the long shadow of a labor movement that is completely pliable with the interests of state power.
It's very corporatist.
And really, it's a very difficult question to even start thinking of what it could look like outside of that or beyond it because of just how pervasive it is.
Yeah, I mean, in Australia, it was our labor movement that really supported the White Australia policy, which for those who don't know is a huge anti-migrant kind of institutional framework throughout the mid-20th century, which basically didn't let anyone who was not kind of Anglo, and maybe if you were lucky, if you were European, you got in. Into the country. It was the Labour Party that really forwarded that as part of, a kind of Labour protection strategy rather than the Liberal Party. This is our history.
Yeah. Now that ended in the 70s, and there's been a sort of, a progressive liberal consensus in politics ever since, but one that obviously doesn't go any way towards resolving the interests of actual people. But when it comes to One Nation especially, as I mentioned earlier, just the politics of national cohesion and the rhetoric around that. You also see that a lot in how One Nation pitches its strategy nowadays. Like Pauline Hanson cut her teeth, first and foremost in sort of opposition to any sort of indigenous rights, but also in anti-Asian migration hate, essentially. And then in the 2010s, when she reemerged back onto the political scene after a decade and a half hiatus, it was anti-Muslim hate. And now even that's shifting towards we can all get together, hold hands and sing Kumbaya as Australians in one big harmony or whatever, as long as you're not indigenous, I guess. In which case you're just a rent seeker.
Lovely. It is interesting then that we do see this trend outside of the United States, although I am hesitant to see it as a long-term trend because in the U.S. it looked like we were heading into a similar quasi retrenchment. I'm not going to say authoritarian, but retrenched liberalism. It was pushing back on certain basic civil rights issues that we saw under Biden. But they lost, and it looks like they may lose in the UK relatively soon too. But then I think about the Liberal Party seems undefeatable a bit in Canada, partly because as soon as they start to lose, Trump opens his mouth, and then they start winning again. And Macron seems to be completely undefeatable, even though he is basically a minoritarian ruler at this point, since he does not have his own party doesn't have significant pull in the parliament. He doesn't poll well. I suppose what I find interesting, and maybe to ask how this applies to an Australian context, is despite the calls for popular frontism, which we really did see from 2016 to 2020 here in the United States, that it hasn't been able to deliver on the one thing it was supposed to deliver, which, I mean, it helped get Biden reelected, but then immediately brought everything back and worse. than when it, you know, got booted out the first time. I say now as like Donald Trump is like hiding counterterrorism information from local governments in response to the Iran war, which may or may not be a war. It may be a special military operation, because there's no such thing as irony in the fucking world. And isn't a legal war here anyway, because we haven't had a legal war here since World War II. We go to war without our own legal framework, weirdly. So how do you argue against the Popular Front in face of people perceiving, true or not, that there's a ascendant right? Because, you know, my argument has been, clearly it doesn't work. We are already back here again, but, you know, you haven't had that experience in Australia. So does it make arguing for that a little bit more difficult?
Well, I think that our kind of politics around the Popular Front is slightly different to other places, because we don't have a first past the post electoral system. And we also have mandatory voting. So you don't have the kind of problem that the Democrats have, where the reason the Popular Front doesn't work is because you can't mobilize working class voters to turn out. So then you don't win a majority. And although we don't have a fully proportional system, because our House of Reps has a preference system, but it's a one-member electorate preference system. So it's kind of, you know, it ends up being in left versus right polarizations. But nonetheless, I mean, you know, you can't make the argument so much that that voting for a left candidate is a problem in Australia, because eventually your preference will flow to a Labor candidate who will these days probably beat the right-wing candidate. Yeah, the calls for the Popular Front are less around electoral politics and more around like rhetoric and trying to recruit people. So, you know, the Socialist Party will sort of do this thing about this classic thing of like you kind of wedge someone on the issue they care about, and hypothetically you then gradually pull them over to more left-wing positions, which of course never happens, so that you don't kind of alienate them, and so that or like the way you kind of undermine the base of the right is by kind of explaining to workers why immigration is not the problem. Which of course, in my opinion, brings the classic problem that a lot of people for, you know, kind of, I mean, you know, there's all these kind of books about the authoritarian personality, whatever. They kind of want the autocrat, the Pauline Hanson autocrat. It's not actually about addressing the economic concern. It's about something much more comprehensive than that, and you can't do that by just sort of being like, well, it's the billionaires that are sort of fucking your housing rather than the immigrants.
Yeah, and I think especially because it like when you say to them, you know, your guy won't win, there's no way to implement the policies you want. I think that's actually part of why they're there in the first place. It's registering an electoral protest far more than any expectation that you will see some kind of autocratic retrenchment occur in your favor, which is why, you know, support for one nation may seem incredibly vast, but at the same time, it operates on very shallow premises that I think people just register as protest.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sort of this is sort of touching on what Milo was talking about. There's sort of no real equivalent to sort of the debate within DSA about there's no at the very least no exact equivalent, and I would argue sort of no real equivalent to the debate within DSA about sort of the democratic ballot line, and whether we use that or not, and sort of the nature of a dirty split or what have you. Sort of the most, even the most sort of popular frontist or conciliatory elements of the socialist left would generally agree that like
You can't run in the Labour Party.
Yeah, you don't run in the Labour Party. You don't even really run in the Greens, right? That a separate ballot line is at the very least not detrimental, because it can't because we both have mandatory voting and mandatory preferential voting. So you really don't have a choice about choosing to eventually give your vote to Labour or not. You have to do it. Otherwise, you have to do it unless you're willing to put the Liberals above Labour, which obviously no one on the left is willing to do. But yeah, so there's really no sort of equivalent to that debate within DSA.
Yeah, so I guess to kind of try to fully answer your question, it is very different. But so the debate, takes the form of like kind of like classic, I guess I would refer to it, and I mean this disparagingly, kind of like Judith Butler-esque coalitionist politics on the left, where it's like, we'll say to kind of the Palestinian diaspora what we need to say to get them on side. We'll say to like this group what we need to say to get them on side. We'll kind of let queer people have their own politics, whatever that means, and we'll all get along. But there is no cohering of a positive united vision at all. That's the real thing for us that we're fighting against.
And electorally, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of the squabbles over, frankly, 5% of the electorate who are young Greens voters, which the Greens party picks up about 10 to 15%, depending on if it's going really good or going mediocre. And of that, it's either people, Gen Xers, who used to vote for a party called the Australian Democrats in the 80s and 90s, but that liquidated. It was this kind of liberal populist political alliance that, eventually liquidated within the Greens movement. That's people essentially like my own mother. But wedging issues such as Palestine and anti-racism are the main ways you appeal a popular front rhetoric to people, but it doesn't actually take up a let's support the Labour Party in any of these things. It is really how best can we cohere frankly, a really small portion of the electorate, which eventually has their preferences flow to a Labour candidate regardless.
But it's an astonishing strategy. I mean, David, I don't know if this was the interaction you had or someone else in Melbourne. I mean, apparently when one of our members, because we're active in the Socialist Party as a faction, as I mentioned, when asked, when we're door knocking, okay, how do you get someone to kind of like, how do you convince someone? Apparently a socialist alternative cadre told us that we should tell them we're the Greens on steroids. Which I'm not sure how that's supposed to make you seem like a different party than the Greens.
Well, yes. This wasn't an interaction I had. It was, I believe, an interaction someone else in Melbourne had. But yeah, sort of this framing of ourselves as sort of
the activist left, but more activist.
A part of a whole left that includes the Greens and Labour. Even though we're not voting for them, we're still sort of partners. We're still sort of independent partners of them in that sense. That's sort of, I think, the manifestation of popular. That's sort of the fundamental manifestation of popular frontism in this country.
Or sort of like the Greek. Sorry.
And sort of to as a note on sort of the numbers involving the Socialist Party here, the Socialist Party in its best election results yet has gotten 1.5% of the vote in the most progressive state in the country. So that's sort of the scale we're talking about here.
Well, it's a little bit confusing when you talk about America, because the PSL is the only party we've had actively running a national candidate of their own in a while. Our Communist Party doesn't, the CPUSA doesn't anymore. I don't think the Socialist Party USA did either. The DSA doesn't. I think since Mimi Solchik died, I don't think they've run one.
Since 04, I think.
As a former Socialist Party fellow traveler, the Greens are the Greens here, but our Greens are particularly notorious for, stunts. But nobody, the last time a left of the Democrats Party got more than 2% of the vote was the Greens under Nader.
2000, yeah.
Yeah. In 2000, and the only socialist parties ever got, with most we've ever gotten, is 1%.
Yes.
What confuses it all is like the internal DSA members within the Democratic Party problem, which is its own problem because they're not even necessarily cadres; they're just endorsees, and depending. So it's hard to know whether you count them or not.
Well, yeah, it's
Whereas,
sort of
frankly,
the whole
that's a
question.
problem with sorry.
It's sort of the whole problem of political parties in the United States, in that sort of the very basic forms of discipline, which are number one available, and number two accepted as normal in Australian politics. That being that if a political party gets to choose who is running on its own ballot line, and the political party is allowed to expel its members, are not really present in American politics. In the
I mean,
Democrats,
the Labour Party is sort of renowned internationally, at least those who know it, as one of the most iron disciplinarian parties in the world.
If you vote, if you vote against the party line on one vote, that's it, you're out.
Yeah, and our party, our electoral parties don't kick people out, and our other political parties, it is a stretch to say they're electoral. Although constitutionally we're not a parliamentary system, we're some weird third thing. So
something from before liberalism, almost.
Yeah. We reread Montesquieu and we're like, let's try that, and we don't understand it. So
we do have the kind of problem that Americans do share, which I would kind of identify as the Sanders and AOC problem. In that, so for example, it's shocking that Socialist Alternative are doing all of this, but their rhetoric around what the Socialist Party is trying to do is get a single socialist elected to parliament, and for this they have chosen a sort of internet micro celebrity called Jordan Vandenlam, also known by his Twitter account as Purple Pingers, who became a micro celebrity because he would do like Instagram videos or whatever of him like in a squat talking about how cool squatting is, etc. And it is cool. But I mean, and then these ostensible Marxists will turn around and say, well, we want a socialist Pauline Hanson, which for reference is the equivalent of saying we want a socialist Donald Trump. I mean, this kind of...
We have such people, just so you know.
Oh, yes, yeah. I mean, but not in the MAGACOM way, in sort of, and the logic really is same as the Sanders and AOC problem, that we will replace kind of any real kind of mass programmatic politics with a demagogue who you can kind of unite behind as your guy, who you could get a beer with or whatever, and that's how we're going to push something. But of course, and obviously we do have some basic discipline. But the problem that we have is, okay, but if Jordan Vanderlam became elected to parliament, and we have a party of 2,000 members nationally, and essentially no robust disciplinary systems, that's run by a kind of trending ever greatly towards rightist sort of sect, and something goes wrong, like he betrays the line, or something comes out about him for whatever reason. I mean, I'm not accusing him of anything at all, but this just happens, in politics. We're fucked. We're so vulnerable if that happens. So that is a similarity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that rhetoric does pop up a lot. And especially after, say, someone like Zoran Mamdani won first the primary, there wasn't so much noise after he won the mayoralty for some reason. I think that's because that looked like more of a progressive victory to begin with. There was the how can socialists learn from Mamdani's experience? And it basically boiled down to wish casting the idea that we had the kind of canvas or ground game that he had during the electoral things. And like any attempt to politically diagnose what his phenomenon meant and how it would affect in a government was lacking in every sense of the term. Like, say, for example, there was a meeting held that we attended here in Canberra where they were talking about him as a person to learn from, but this was like a day or two after his first meeting with Trump. And when that topic comes up, members of Socialist Alternative would essentially just say, "Did you see that, guys?" Like stuttering for about 5 seconds before saying, "Like, I just don't even have words." Like, this is the sort of thing I would expect to come out of the words of my own mum, who I love, but she is a former Maddo in Trump 1, Midas touch in Trump 2, believes anything that Trump won was stolen, and that narcissism is the worst problem in American politics. All that sort of stuff. I would not expect this out of someone who wants to try and cohere a sort of socialist strategy. Like, if you ask me on the same thing, I would say it's very clear that these are two people, Trump and Mamdani, who want to de-escalate from other things that they have going on around them, that they really need to not escalate to the point of outright war between their two respective offices.
Yeah,
but that doesn't fly.
Socialist Alternative was so deeply confused about the Mamdani stuff because they were ostensibly opposed to it and wanted to kind of use it as an opportunity to talk about, reformism bad, revolutionary, Trotskyist, or whatever, politics good, while running the exact same show that he is.
I don't know if you've seen this yet, Myla, but like the Socialist Alternative, at least on the campus of my university, has been putting up posters with sort of advertising its "What is Socialism" events, which it runs at the start of every year. And on those posters are Marx, Lenin, Luxemburg, Mamdani, and Hassan Piker.
Oh my god!
Yeah,
it is so profoundly shameful.
Can you send me a photo of that?
I'll send you a photo of that later when I get.
Oh my god!
That's what they're running now. That is what they are running now. And
dear Oceania, do not listen to the Americans. We will betray you. No.
And during when
they will
Mamdani
betray
won
you,
the
Australian.
When Mamdani won the primary, I remember in sort of the VS group chats where they were there, they had like a somewhat sensible perspective about it. They had the sort of they sort of laid out sort of reason, like correct criticisms of Mamdani, putting aside the fact that they are doing the exact same thing. And now that Mamdani is the big hot thing, they have dropped it entirely.
Yeah.
So I think
so cynical, so opportunistic.
It's just so clearly
there's not really an attempt to, once it comes out of the public attention, engage with an issue to understand what's really going on behind the surface. Like, because being a university student, you're going to get that when you talk to a lot of members of our groups. But at the university, especially last year, there was a vice chancellor who essentially has full plenipotentiary powers delegated to them, was in the process of cutting all, like about 800 academic positions, including casual staff, who, as of recently, were no longer being paid. The classic things that you would see in virtually any academy nowadays. That vice chancellor was ousted after a prolonged, sort of battle between virtually everyone within the university or within sort of Canberra's progressive electorate, who were just fed up with it. They brought in a new vice chancellor as an interim who effectively continued the exact same things, just much quieter, which is honestly one of the most tried and true tactics you'll see in history. You bring in you bring in a bull in a china shop that smashes everything, And then when they're ousted, you bring in someone who talks about peace and unity and moving on from things while they're doing the exact same thing. And when I brought this kind of explanation up to someone then, because this person was heavily involved in trying to get the original vice chancellor ousted, she was like, I'm sorry, are you defending her?
I mean, Derek, I think what you're seeing is that, because, you know, I know I have listened to a couple of the episodes of this podcast, more than a couple, a handful. The sort of, we are at the beginning of the process of getting really pissed off with the rest of the left that you've sort of gone through and come out the other end of. You know,
Yeah, makes sense.
all commies in our early 20s, you know, sort of, you know, all we want to do is complain. It feels good.
Yeah.
I still can't get over that poster.
As long as you don't do the "why I left the left" post or the left of capitalism move, which was my favorite left comment / ultimate move, because I'm like, okay, what else is there though? It's like I'm like, left is a relative term. Or is there something like when you were the left of the Comintern and we could kind of pretend that the Comintern was communist? That stance made sense, but now it's just, you know, a way out. So yeah, it makes sense. If you're in your early 20s, you're gonna be mad at other leftists. And I think, you know, the danger, on one hand, young people have way more energy than me. I'm old. Like, you know, Spike keeps me looking relatively young, but like, you know, I am closer to 50 than not. And I've been doing this left shit for 20 years. And I started late, actually. I started in my mid to late 20s. What is frustrating is that you burn through so many people.
Yeah.
And that's what you don't want your org to do. And to tie this back to, you know, your unity organization a little bit, but why I am not anti-faction is faction battles that are open, is embarrassing as they are, and as seemingly backbiting as they can appear to be, are still better than when those are hidden faction battles that are around personality cults within an organization. And, you know, I deal with this in unions too, where we, you know, our teachers union kind of sort of has factions, not really, but there are factions de facto. And with a faction ban, you just have the stakes become higher, and the all or nothingness makes it where people are even more backstabby. It's just not obvious to the general public.
Yeah.
And that burns people out, just eats through new people.
I mean, Socialist Alternative, who, as said, has 700 members, their turnover rate has been at least twice that. They go through first-year students like nobody's business. They burn through them so fast. Yeah. I mean, the kind of organization we're talking about is one where, you know, we have, you know, heard stuff now that, like, if you try to join and you're a full-time worker, they will ask you to become at least part-time, or else you're not really eligible to be a cadre. Or, you know, and they're famous. I don't know how common this is with trot groups, again, quote unquote trot groups in the US, but they do this classic thing where they will get their students' degrees to at least double in length so they can keep doing student politics. So, you know, they'll tell their, like, members to go down to like 2 or 1 course a year, rather than the standard, which is, a semester, rather than the standard, which is 4, so that you can extend it out. I mean, you know, it's classic.
Yeah, everything trust is a 7-year undergraduate.
People make jokes all the time about them being in like year 7 of a 10-year undergraduate degree or what have you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
With the factionalism, definitely. You also see, and this is especially elucidated within our organization sometimes, because while it might not look like there are many internal factions, that's not for lack of trying. And that's mostly just on the account of, well, effective, one, being a very young organization, but 2, what happens when you have open factions is, unlike in the cases where you're a clandestine group looking to either plan a split or take over an organization, that coheres people in such a way far more than any political line ever would. You don't have to actually sort out the contradictions in your own camp if you are working towards, great opposition to some internal enemy. And, really within our organization, the only two factions that have emerged beyond sort of interpersonal friendship groups, you could say, is like what represents the mainstream of, the cosmonaut, weekly worker inflected faction, which called themselves the Mountain during our conference, Montagnards and whatnot, and then the Spartacists themselves, who have organized into the Spartacist tendency. Now, that's not for want of people wanting to try and organize different factions, say around cybernetic planning or being left communists. In fact, I would consider myself the closest to the left communists within the organization politically, even though I don't think I am one. I can get into that way later. It's that coordinating yourself as a left of the party center or different to it on political questions has in many cases been either consumptive or differences in reading groups, because it's very hard to do that kind of stuff when really what an openly factional organization demands is that you embed your politics within a group rather than hold it to very solipsistic beliefs of your own.
No,
I mean, the state we're in is that we've been criticized before because in our reading group on the classics of Marxism, we dare to read Bernstein. Not because we support Bernstein, but because you need to know your fucking history. Because, if something's in your reading group, you must obviously support it.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
As a person who makes reading lists for groups that you can't support all the things on the reading list and be a coherent human being, I find that sort of laughable, but it is funny. I mean, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about early communist history that come from the fact that people just won't read the original sources; they'll read tertiary sources on them. Like Alan Wood's opinion of Ted Grant's opinion of Trotsky's opinion on the Kautsky and Lenin debates, and those things, those almost Talmudic level of interpretive commentary is useful. It's just not, it's not useful if you're not willing to look at the primary text. And also, just to be completely honest, the primary text doesn't also dictate reality.
Members of our organization aren't what people pejoratively or positively call neo-Kautskyists. In fact, I think within our organization of nearly 100 people, there's only really one or two people I could actually describe, or who would self-describe themselves as inspired by Kautsky. And that's a very difficult thing to hold. But I assume just when you're outside of a group like ours, conflating your bookshelf and your analysis with your norms is pretty much the biggest mistake you can make. And it's also the most pervasive one.
Yeah, it is. It is incredibly pervasive. I often think of it as Protestant brainness, but unfortunately, it's not. It's not unique to the Anglosphere or to Protestants, so I can't really do the whole cultural explanation and be a bad historical materialist.
We're the most Catholic socialist group in Australia.
Yeah.
I think with regards to factions in the Socialist Party, I think one important development that has sort of come about as a result of our intervention is that there's sort of this this desire among a lot of the Socialist Party, both inside of and outside of Socialist Alternative, because sort of the independents in the Socialist Party are really to Socialist Alternatives right, and really quite substantially so on average. There's this kind of this really like anti-factional attitude that you see among a lot of these people.
Especially because they tend to be ex-Greens.
Yes, they tend to be ex-Greens as well. There's sort of this attitude of you should sort of don't sort of bring out these questions that could divide us. Don't sort of risk the temptation of a split by sort of making clear political difference by sort of exposing political differences or anything like that. There's sort of this aversion to that and sort of a sense that the political difference itself is a danger. And exposing them is a danger, and you see this in your party with the Corbyn faction as well. I think is another section that demonstrates this.
Yeah, well, I think something that's added onto that as well is, especially because a lot of these people come from the ex-Greens, is kind of this logic that although kind of political decision making internally can kind of decide broad principles, that specific policies should basically be drafted by internal party technocrats through kind of what's the word, like focus group marketing techniques, to just whatever gets the best vote.
And I mean, this is why when we do our interventions, we're usually quite averse to anything looking like a fist fight on the conference floor, right? Because we know what happens in situations where you do that sort of thing. It's that you don't end up defeating the tendency you think is capturing an organization. You just end up empowering something directly to its right, which has all of the ideological infrastructure of the rest of society and their political parties to go, well, there's so much sectarian infighting here, we just need to expel all the bad apples in the movement, and then we can get on and do real politics. Like, that's the end result of being just brutally sectarian, even though you're still participating in the same front.
Yeah, it is. There's one issue I want to bring up because it was in your conference, and maybe it's a good one to end on, but it's one that's specific to Australia, and that is the struggle for liberation of the people of Papua. Papua New Guinea, and we have an equivalent to it in the United States, which would be Puerto Rico and Guam and American Samoa and probably the U.S. Canary Islands. I can go on, but no, the U.S. Virgin Islands, not Canary Islands. We don't have any things there, because we have these Commonwealth that even most people in the States have totally forgotten exist, like completely. But weirdly they don't come up that much even in indigenous struggles, which is also its own interesting thing. Puerto Rico does, but the others I mentioned are often just completely forgotten. How did that vote go? And how is that issue viewed both on the Australian left and in Australian society in general?
It's viewed with irrelevance, first of all. Similarly, I don't remember the last time I heard an Indigenous activist refer to Papua at all. Maybe it's better down in Melbourne, David. No?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah.
Well, in Melbourne, you will on occasion see like West Papua flags at protests.
Yeah. But that's funny because that's West Papua, so technically it's a struggle against Indonesia rather than.
You definitely do not see PNG flags.
Indeed.
If Papua is brought up at all, it will be West Papua, not
because no one wants to stain what they think is important with memories of when Papua New Guinea was a protectorate of this country. And it's just assumed that they had their independence and everything sorted itself out. But I mean, to point even to just today, there's been security treaties signed in just the past few weeks, which effectively merged the police forces of Papua New Guinea with that of Australia. So from the analysis of many of our comrades, they're almost there is almost no distinction to be made between these two different national boundaries because they are subject to the same impositions.
Yeah, I mean, the way
Sorry,
it went,
not the military, just police,
the way the vote went on the floor, is there was universal agreement with essentially the kind of substance of it, which is that, you know, we should seek to organize communists in PNG and West Papua. Just in Oceania in general, we should forge more connections. We should try to recruit people and to support kind of a national liberation struggle. Most of our members would, unlike the Spartacists potentially, although that's kind of unclear, there might be kind of some humming and hawing about what national liberation, supporting national liberation would be. You know, whether that's a kind of like, you know, communist struggle with kind of national liberation elements, or whether that's a national struggle, you know, with domestic elites or whatever, or with tribes, or you know, whatever. I mean, there are barely any domestic bourgeoisie in PNG. It's mostly tribes people. But the main thing is the main opposition to the motion was primarily led by myself personally. And it wasn't opposition so much as I am generally opposed, and I try to promote this culture, to any kind of taking a stance on stuff like that without a strategy for actually achieving your goals. I find this kind of like, oh, it'd be great if this happened. Anyway, I find that sort of stuff very bad culturally for an organization. And essentially what I told the comrade who drafted it up and the conversation we had at conference was kind of like, okay, I mean, how are we recruiting people here? I mean, what's also funny is I think this is like a common dynamic in Australia as well, where it's kind of like, oh, we should have more members in regional areas. But unfortunately, the strategy of sending city dwellers to regional areas often has the opposite effect. It just sort of
it usually doesn't go well.
Very silly. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, I don't think we should just send, you know, white Australians over to PNG to recruit Papuans. I think it's a bad idea. So that was the main thing is, you know, what is our strategy for achieving this? I think it was amended to quite explicitly become an aspirational thing rather than something we aim to do anytime soon as a result of that.
I mean, I wish we had enough money to rusticate people, right? I mean, because I come from the rural areas, having moved here to the cities, and I mean, it's very understandable trying to get that kind of organization going. It's just, there's maybe it's too early to tell because we are still quite young and small, and there are people who outside the major cities do have some impact. But on the Papua New Guinea thing, this was something that I essentially spoke at that conference with the exact same concerns of like, okay, we need to do this liaising, but who are we even interfacing with? And what my worry was having all these statements, it looks declarative without really much clarity. And that, you know, it'd be great if we could help refound the Communist Party in Indonesia or something like that. But there are dozens of cultural reasons why that, even in spite of it being de facto banned just de jure banned by the state in Indonesia, that you couldn't have that emerge within youth politics there. Where it's like, you know, and this gets back to what was mentioned at the beginning about like an opposition at conference, this idea of actionism. It was called activism or actionism. Not to have coined the term, but to have put that in the article, which is where people are running with it. It's not to say that like you just want to do protest action all the time and have constant momentum. So that's certainly a part of it. It's that really you are letting the 24-hour news cycle dictate everything that you make your normative claims and your positive program. And not to disparage the Spartacists, because I do believe they have, you know, even more than just the aspiration to want to respond to those sorts of things. They have done things. But it's like when what you put forward as an alternative program is an assessment that there is a global rise of the far right and that there is imperialism and militarism on the rise, that's great to have in your analysis, but it, like, again, it gets to the thing of like, why do we eschew even a minimum like statement of programmatic unity in the face of that? It's like, okay, we have an immediate thing to react to, but really The problem being is that you either spread yourself way too thin, or you end up looking like a bunch of hypocrites because you don't actually end up affecting anything within the things you claim to hold dear to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wrote about in the Weekly Worker as well. Yeah.
Hmm.
I
That
think
makes a lot of
that
sense.
sort of, I think that sort of to sort of bring this no, don't worry. Actually, it wasn't too relevant. It was only very tangentially relevant.
Okay, I guess this brings me to where we can talk about your program, like some of the key planks and how you want to go about implementing them. And that's just my broad question. This will be our final one for the session today.
Cool. I guess we can answer that in the three parts of the question. You'd answered it one each. So in terms of its key planks, it now has 17 kind of points, which are then, have sort of more specific stuff underneath them. And there's a bunch. Each of those points is like a headline. Like for workers' democracy, for control over production, for women's liberation, for gay liberation, for indigenous liberation, etc. The key planks there are the way that we kind of envision this program is this is how the whole program taken together, if implemented in full, is a dictatorship of the proletariat. Over all aspects of life. I think in comparison to a lot of sort of similar programs, we really emphasize, or at least I do personally, the women's liberation element, because for us, that's part of workers seizing control over the reproduction of daily life, rather than it being left up to kind of, capitalists and, patriarchs, etc. I think that's a good summary. We want to, we can't socialize the entire economy straight away, but we can essentially put the economy with all meaningful respects into our hands, us being the workers. That's the other two parts of that question.
Yeah, to the next two parts.
Remind me what the other two parts of the question were.
Implementation was one.
Yeah, how to implement.
Implementation and...
Maybe there was only two. Whatever. Just go.
Yeah, let's go with implementation and yeah.
Well, I guess the main thing to say there is that we have the orientation of the strategy of patience in the sort of actually, I should talk about first sort of the strategy of regroupment, which I think at this point is largely focused on the Socialist Party as a prospect for both regroupment and sort of revolutionization. So currently, like, we don't see sort of the main outlook for real unity as being like more mergers on the lines of what we got with the Spartacists. I think there's generally an acknowledgement that was probably a bit of a, what do you call it? A
bit of a fluke.
Yeah, well, I was looking for something a bit more interesting to say than fluke, but but yeah, something. Yeah, it's not something that's going to happen again. Is it a white whale? Is that what you call it? Or something like that. It's not something that's going to be replicated most.
A black swan.
A black swan. That's what it is. A black swan. Yes. It's not something that we're probably going to see like happen over and over again until we have a party. What instead we think it is sort of more likely and sort of a more realistic strategy is winning the Socialist Party to revolutionary politics and to partyism, winning it to sort of winning it to a revolutionary program, preferably our program, and then winning for the Socialist Party hegemony over the entirety of the left, and therefore sort of making forcing the other and through that forcing the other groups to to either join the Socialist Party or render themselves completely irrelevant by sort of winning hegemony for the Socialist Party. So that's sort of our strategy for regroupment, which obviously, in order to implement the program, we have to have parties to implement the program. Sort of in terms of further implementation beyond that, I think what you're looking at is sort of our strategy for power. And our strategy for power is a strategy of patience, whereby the Socialist Party takes power once it is demonstrated that it has the support of a majority of the population and the confidence of the working class. This can be demonstrated in a number of ways. This can be demonstrated by, say, an electoral victory. It could be demonstrated through the bourgeois state ending elections because they know that an electoral victory of our party would be inevitable. But the gist is that we would need a majority of the population, that we would need majority support in order to implement the program, and that once that is demonstrated, the party would undertake some sort of insurrection to abolish the bourgeois and to overthrow the bourgeois state. That's essentially my conception of it.
So, in some ways, it's a 1918 Bolshevik program.
Yeah.
I mean, we were specifically referred to the kind of electoral strategy we want the Socialist Party to adopt as a Bolshevik electoral strategy. There's a lot of specifics there that are sort of currently being ironed out because we're a group that only really started in 2022. So for example, next conference we're probably likely to debate the specifics of that electoral strategy. I, for example, am quite not abstentionist, sorry, obstructionist, which I know you've spoken about before, Derek, and others less so. In fact, we have some left comms who kind of lean towards abstentionist in some ways. And then the specifics of what our trade union strategy is, I think that there's a lot of questions there, at least for me personally, because a big part of the conference and sort of the faction of the RCO that Communist Unity now that I'm part of, which sort of we, at least for now, colloquially call the Mountain as a sort of joke on Robespierre's faction in the French Revolution, is we don't want our activity in kind of economic struggles, whether that's, tenant organizing, trade unions, whatever, to be just a sort of more militant form of left laborism. We actually do want to somehow really connect economic struggles to the revolutionary horizon. We are not quite sure what that looks like yet, I think, or at least I'm not. And also that definitely can't be done kind of through the current unions because of how sort of moribund they are. It would require the formation or at least the restructuring of kind of new unions, which I don't mean red unions, although that is a debate in the RCO as well. So there's a lot of big questions on that strategy so far. But yeah, I think broadly you could argue it is inspired by the Bolsheviks and to some extent by kind of the SPD, although there's a lot of criticisms there.
Yeah. I mean, maybe this gets around to where I register, like, not outright dissent, but like a request for either clarity or that people think this through a bit more. And that's saying when, for example, we were reading Revolutionary Strategy as a reading group in my city, a big portion of time when they were talking about, the strategy of patience, I was like, how do you even register that majority? It's not like you get a 50% plus one, and then all of a sudden, let's get out the barricades, right? And I think this is with personal correspondence for someone who I know knows Mike McNair, who says that he would be tweaking bits of revolutionary strategy to say that might include stuff like an international majority, because otherwise that looks very weird. You'd just be rehashing what the SPD would be advocating for. And I guess what I mean to get by that is to say the programmatic struggle for a majority of society to then which you can implement your program. I think, in my view, is part of a problem I have sometimes with like a partyist tendency within the left, which is to overcorrect from economism to be like almost the political arena determines downstream almost everything that you can struggle for. I'm not accusing that directly of comrades to my left and right, but I think there are some very difficult questions that are going to have to be asked, especially if signs of momentum towards even the mass party stage start emerging. And I would be lying if I said I knew how to start answering them. Like, one example I've had in my head is maybe you just include the maximum as another thing, like way more up in front, to say that like this is the minimum of like what we expect a social society looks like. And you can, in ways that, like, say someone like Phil Neal does, like, you know, cast that back onto the present to say this is how the industrial landscape has been transformed, and that's how the communist horizon has shifted its its material bases. And so
I think there's definitely consensus that the idea of launching a revolution in Australia, even if we had a majority, without the backing of a revolution in at least one nuclear armed state, would be ridiculous.
Yeah, but that's
Fair.
not what you get from, say, the Cliffists, which, I mean, one of their big pamphlets introducing Marxism, which is like the thing they get all their young'uns to read and read once, and that's pretty much the only thing you ever end up reading in full. There's a lot of really weird things that if you read it directly makes it almost look like they're supporting the idea that capital is still a monopoly capital, and that you almost have like the Engels and Kautsky thing of you can just take control of the political sphere and the economy has already sorted itself out towards a socialist mode of production anyways, which I find insane. It goes to say that a strategy for majority does have to check itself beyond what we've already established, and that'll be a constant process of learning from new people we onboard. But suffice to say that we understand very well that the contours of class struggle have shifted dramatically since programmatism was the main thing of the left.
To register, I have a similar worry about revolutionary strategy, which I tend to agree with. But I've done 2 reading groups with it. One was recorded, and you can find it somewhere.
I've listened to bits of that one.
Okay. It was with an Irish man that we like to yell at each other. But there are some. I also thought that there was an overcorrecting against economism that has been made in some of these McNairist circles. Almost to like a political determinism, to the point of weirdly agreeing with ultra leftists like EndNote's communization theorists, but from a completely different perspective, that the labor movement was actually a political creation, like directly. And I do think that means we need to clarify a strategy of patience. Like, sincerely, we have to do that. The other thing is, there are a couple of things where I'm like, we don't have time. like you know, I'm not saying that climate change is going to kill us all in the next 5 or 10 days, or even the next generation necessarily, but we are running out of time to intervene. And so, you know, there's that. And this is for another conversation, but I find it interesting, Christina, you bring it up. I also thought we needed to add a maximalist position back to the program structure. That we needed immediate demands, and the activists can go to that. We needed a minimum program of unity, and then we needed a maximalist, or at least an orientation. If not, you know, I don't know how you do a maximalist program. That's, you know, it's almost but.
I mean, I think, you know, the maximum is a key part of the Communist Unity program. I mean, I think it should be fleshed out more in detail. I agree, because I am concerned about, you know, you can get the SPD thing where it kind of becomes irrelevant. But I will say, I think the kind of CPGB thing, which I would agree is also an error, which I think, funnily enough, McNair stated quite explicitly in his recent arguments with in the letters section of Weekly Worker with a Spartacist member, where it's a struggle in trade unions is kind of, not a big deal. We should focus on political issues. I think that my problem with this is I think that basically that is an attempt to deal with the concern that I laid out just then, which is how do you link program to economic struggle? And I think that is reneging the need to answer the question. I think we do need some way to link them together. I just personally don't know what it is. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to discover a movement that I have some sympathy with outside of the United States, and it doesn't sound like you're in a whole lot better of a situation than us. But it does sound like you have different problems. The DSA's relationship to the Democratic Party is not something you're going to argue about in perpetuity forever.
Well, I mean, frankly, having left electeds who are either endorsees or cadres would frankly be a good problem to have in this sort of situation, because you don't even have that here.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we may have it soon. We may have it soon, depending on how the state election in Victoria goes.
Maybe.
We may get a couple of what would be equivalent to your state senators. One or two, if we're lucky.
Yeah, we are pushing for one here in Utah, and I have publicly stated a few times that while I support him,
doesn't mean you're going to campaign for him.
I'm not canvassing for him. Fuck that. But I'll give him money, which I actually don't like doing because he's still a fucking Democrat. But he's a union brother too, so I kind of have to. But I think there's a rat's ass chance that hell he wins. I mean, this is the problem that we have. Like with our problem with the Mamdani strategy is actually somewhat similar to yours. Is that we're so highly federated, people are trying to pull a strategy that worked in New York that there's no pathway for in some states here. I live in the confusingly, since America in the late 90s decided we were going to reverse the color associations for the entire fucking planet and change red to conservative and blue to liberal, which it is liberal, but anyway, I live in one of the quote reddest states in the country. We have I live in an urban area that is fairly liberal. There are a few socialists here, and there are even less now than there used to be in some ways, because we are where Charlie Kirk got shot. So even though there are still, I mean, there are a lot of social, I don't think there's been a decline in the numbers. There's been a decline of the number of people who are willing to actively associate with a left-wing organization in certain areas. So we are not repressed by the state. We don't have that problem. That would imply that we were effective. It is interesting here, and that's a lot of the U.S., to be quite frank. I think maybe I should ask you guys this, because this is a problem that we have in the U.S. That may be particular to ours. Usually, it's not a problem to have your communists concentrated in a major urban area. If you have a relatively democratic system, but we have a federalized system. Of 50 states where the communists are basically in two. New York and California, to some degree, Washington State, and to some degree, Oregon, although Oregon's also full of literal Nazis. So it's like...
It's the best state in the union for that.
Yeah. If you just want to watch white people go to retire and fight each other in politics, that's where you go.
And then people try to extrapolate it on the entire U.S.
Yeah, it's weird because there's a lot of people like Portland's the future of America, and I'm like, no, it is absolutely not. It is like, but anyway, but I sometimes wonder if this kind of American problem is actually, it is a way into the problems you have, because like we don't have any electeds either, and we have well, I shouldn't say wasted. We have attempted to learn how to organize by failing to get candidates through for 3/4 of a decade here in Salt Lake. And maybe we'll get one through. I strategy of patience and all that. But it is an interesting comparison problem. It's also interesting because, and I think, for my American listeners listening who tuned out as soon as we started talking about Australia and like didn't know who anybody was.
Very American.
Yes.
Yeah, you guys know all our shit. It is amazing to me that I hear people in like Cairo who can talk to me about the mayor of New York.
Well, you're forcing us to know this. You're in charge.
Yeah. Well,
it's not my choice.
Yeah. Well, we do in the organization try to keep people in touch with what's going on in, say, China or the UK, and there's a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, just one of those things.
If I might sort of say what I think about one of the problems of sort of DSA federalism, and the fact that DSA has like a couple of parochial, very strong sections, and a lot of otherwise relatively weak ones. Sort of what comes to mind for me there is that I think that there's a truth about sort of running and discipline that DSA has continually failed to accept, which is that if you are not solely responsible for your candidate being elected, if you are not solely capable of ending that candidate's career by removing your support from them, which DSA is not able to do to basically any of the people that it elects, either as independents or on the Democratic ballot line. That issue is separate to this. DSA alone could not end Mamdani's career, right?
No.
Mamdani has an independent base separate from DSA, which he could use to run as mayor even without DSA support. If you don't have that, then I think that even New York and LA/San Francisco, even those sections of the DSA, if you don't have that, I don't think you should be running CAN. I don't think you should have elected officials without
frankly,
sole responsibility.
Or frankly, if you don't even have a single pen pusher who it has any way into controlling the implementation process of what an elected would be doing. I know Mamdani's political team is actually a lot savvier than I expected, but in the majority of situations when you have the left pitching, we just need to have 1,000 Zohar Mamdanis bloom across the country, or on the opposite extreme, we just need to recreate the Italian base unions or whatnot, and then that'll solve all our problems.
Yeah.
The crucial problem of having people within the state apparatus who are amenable to understanding of what the goal is beyond the immediate election cycle or the floor vote within a chamber. It's one of those things that you have to square, or otherwise you're going to end up in a situation where your only constituency is the independent major party people that elected you.
I mean, you're speaking to the choir on this one, because this is my major problem with both the DSA and even some of my fellow McNair friendly people is trying to implement it without an independent organization. I'm not even saying it has to be a party, but one that actually controls, I don't know, a whole borough of a city, not even a city council, just a borough that could actually prove that they could hold a candidate accountable in such a way that if they remove their endorsement, it would be a removal from office because people were loyal to the organization. Then that's my big deal. And I'm with you. I think we waste a lot of energy on this. To give you guys some feedback on what I'm doing, I got told in my chapter to either take over the labor committee, which in a chapter of 150 people only had like 5 people in it, or let it go on indefinite hiatus so we could do electoral work. And then when I said, well, what were you guys doing? It's like, we were trying to salt. And I was like, no one's hiring in America right now. Are you salting? Like,
same problems here. Yeah.
And also, your salters all have bright DSA signs on their social media under their real name. In
Utah, of all places.
So it's gonna stand out. So and since then I've like not been as active as I've wanted to be, actually, because I've had to deal with my own union stuff. But I find it interesting because it's not because like the chapter is like horribly opportunist or anything. It isn't. Like, it's not like we're dominated by like Democratic Party hack. In fact, in Salt Lake, what are they going to do? Like there's no like there's like 2 NGOs they could go to after they leave us. What are they going to do? So it seems to be a pernicious problem. And you guys talked about a lot of the cosmonaut, and I don't want to keep you forever. We've been talking for over 2 hours, but I do want to talk about briefly the other neo-Kautskyists in America, which are the bread and roses, Eric Blanc, Ackerman people. Now, if you don't, friends don't know who those people are, more power to you. But I know you guys follow our politics, so you probably do. And what I have seen those people be is post-Cliffist without even that. Guard for, I mean, for example, those factions do they do some good work on labor and whatnot, but so I'm not slagging them off entirely, but they will tell us we have to stay loyal to the Democratic Party and formally endorse Biden early. And that they baffle me because I don't know how they read McNair's book and like came away with that as a strategy.
Well, what's fascinating is it's funny you mentioned the
you want to know the funniest thing,
because so the main theorist of socialist alternative here, the post-Cliffite group, Mick Armstrong, is a huge fan of Lenin rediscovered, which baffles us. It feels like it's also completely counter to their understanding of 1917.
Yeah, but I mean, the closest thing socialist alternative has come to a theoretical critique of osteocommunist unity, whatever, was an article they published in Marxist Left Review, which is their big paper, runs with
theoretical journal,
runs with Haymarket. I think you can find their bookstores everywhere. Their thing was they basically lumped Mike McNair and Eric Blanc into the same paragraph when talking about this, and saying
zombie Kautskyism was their article.
Yeah, zombie Kautskyism is the name of the article, and it's bad for a number of reasons. But the main thing is to say that like Eric Blanc is put forward as the expression of what we believe, funnily enough. And, just an example of the political like torsion that we're talking about here, the post-Cliffists here are attacking someone who sounds like a post-Cliffist in your country over issues that the post-Cliffists hear by Chinese whispers from a debate that was over 100 years ago. And because someone dares to even talk about Kautsky, like even when they're talking about his mistakes, like it's it either looks incoherent or you have non-revolutionary politics.
But yeah, I mean, our position on this is basically that we recognize that Kautsky was important for Lenin's development, but we got Lenin in a divorce. Is kind of our position, and Eric Blanc can keep Kautsky.
Yeah, I feel like Eric Blanc like read Lenin Rediscovered and then decided that he liked post 1917 Kautsky, which is it's like, yay, Gorlitz program. That's gonna make everyone happy. Anyway, where can people find out about you if they're interested, and find any of your documents or anything like that?
So basically everything's on the website, which is revcomorg.info.
Okay.
That also contains a link to Partisan, which is partisanmagazine.org. That's basically everywhere. I mean, we're also like, on Twitter and Instagram, but I mean, that's just basically reposting articles and statements which you can put up on Partisan anyway. So.
There is a social forum Discord we can maybe give a link to, but there's also a publication known as the Labour Tribune, which is essentially people within the Labour Party who are committed to revolutionary politics and have a lot of experience in union work and also comment quite frequently on ALP and politics from a Marxist perspective. And I think those guys are just as important in some cases as the project that we're trying to do. And that sets us apart from a lot of groups on the left, and even talking to people who have anything to do with the Labour Party whatsoever, where that's very rare apparently.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's covering all bases.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on.
having us.
Thank you very much.
It was great coming on, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad we got to do some comparisons between our two national projects. Particularly just because I want, if we're going to force you to deal with our bullshit all the time, we should at least kind of know yours. Like, this is, I mean, Australia maybe is a little far away, but we don't even, like, Americans only recently started paying attention to who the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Canada were. So
baby steps.
We'll get
that's gradualism, David. We have to throw the Americans in right away.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.